Welcome to the Black Box AI podcast. We're diving into something really cool today. A paper you sent us, the Perceptron. It's by Frank Rosenblatt from way back in 1958.
Wow, 1958.
Yeah, it kind of sets the stage for all this neural network stuff we talk about. And
Mhm.
honestly, reading it, I was blown away by how much of it still feels super relevant to AI today. Like, it's held up amazingly well.
Yeah, you're not kidding. It's a total landmark. Rosenblatt was wrestling with huge EE questions back then. How does the brain actually store information? How does learning happen? How do we make decisions? I mean, these are still the big mysteries.
Right. And what's crazy is before the perceptron, most brain models were like all about perfect logic, everything
Yeah.
connected in this neat, orderly way.
Exactly. And then Rosenblatt comes along and says, nope, hold on. He throws in randomness, imperfection, probability, says that's way closer to how our messy brains actually work.
That's so cool. Like, he took these stiff theoretical models and made them way more real. And right from the get-go, Rosenblatt lays out these three big questions about how biological systems sense, store, and use information. Like, he's trying to figure out how we go from the physical world out there to the world inside our heads.
Absolutely. And he gets right into these two big theories about information storage, code and memory and connectionist theory. The coded memory idea is basically like, imagine having a mental photograph for everything you've ever experienced. Every sight, sound, feeling, a perfect copy in your brain.
So like our brains are giant hard drives, just storing a perfect copy of everything.
Exactly. But the connectionist theory, which is where the perceptron fits in, says it's not about perfect copies. It's more about the connections between neurons. The more you experience something, the stronger those connections become. And that fits with this idea of plasticity, right? Our brains are constantly changing and rewiring based on what we learn.
So it's not a hard drive, it's more like a network, constantly evolving. Makes sense. But okay, enough teasing. What is a perceptron? Like, break it down for us.
Think of it like a simplified brain model, a network of these little units all working together. It's got a retina, which is like our senses taking in information from the outside world. Then there are association cells, or A units. These guys receive the input from the retina. And finally, we've got responses, R units. They're triggered by the A units.
Okay, so like a little mini brain on paper.
Yeah.
And here's where that randomness comes in, right? The connections between those A units, they're not neatly organized, are they? They're all random. Why is that so important?
Because, well, that's how our brains actually are. It's not all neat and tidy up there. Our brains are constantly rewiring, adapting, making new connections based on what we experience. That randomness is a big part of what makes the perceptron such a powerful model. It captures that dynamic, always changing nature of learning.
So our brains are more like a jazz band, improvising and adapting, not just playing the same sheet music over and over.
Love that analogy.
Now, there's this thing Rosenblatt keeps mentioning, value. Don't worry, listeners, we're not talking about money here. What's the deal with value in a perceptron?
So each A unit gets assigned a value. It basically tells you how much influence that A unit has on its connected responses. Think of it like adjusting the volume knob on different signals in the brain.
Okay, some signals get turned up, others get turned down. Makes sense. And then there are these three models, right? Alpha, beta, gamma. These describe how those values change. Can you walk us through those like in simple terms?
Sure. The alpha model is pretty straightforward. Whenever an A unit gets activated, its value goes up a little, like it's getting a little reward every time it fires.
The more it fires, the more important it gets.
Exactly. But the beta model is different. It's not about each A unit gaining value individually. It's like a group of A units have a set amount of value to share. They divvy it up based on how active each one is. Think of it like a team bonus. The most active members get the bigger share.
Ah, okay. So less about individual gain, more about how the activity is spread out in the group. Interesting. And then gamma. What's that one all about?
Gamma is where it gets really interesting. In this model, the total value within a group of A units always stays the same. But when one A unit gains value, some others have to lose value to keep things balanced, like a constant tug of war, where the balance of power is always shifting.
Whoa, that's wild. So it's like a checks and balances system, but for neurons. Okay, so we've got randomness, we've got value. I'm really starting to see how all this comes together.
Right, and it all feeds into how the perceptron actually learns and figures things out.
Okay, well, let's get into that then. Let's talk about how the perceptron learns. All right, so we've laid some groundwork, but now I want to get a little more into the mechanics of how the perceptron actually learns. Rosenblatt brings up this thing called the probability of it making the right choice between two responses, after it's been trained on a bunch of stimuli. What's that all about?
Think of it like a test score. How well did the perceptron learn its lesson? Can it pick the right answer after seeing all those examples? Rosenblatt, he built this whole mathematical framework for figuring out PR, taking into account things like how many training examples you've got, the specifics of the perceptron itself. It's pretty neat.
So, like a recipe for perceptron success. You tweak the ingredients, see how it affects the outcome. But what I find really fascinating is this PG thing, probability of correct generalization.
Mm-hmm.
So that's measuring how well it does with something totally new, right? Like not just parroting back what it's learned, but actually applying that knowledge to something unfamiliar.
That's the heart of it, yeah, the real test. And what Rosenblatt finds is that in certain cases, PG, that probability of getting it right with something brand new, it can actually get pretty close to the same value as PR. Like it can perform almost as well on something it's never seen before as on something it's been trained on.
Whoa, hold on. So you're saying this simple model can actually generalize that well? That seems kind of crazy.
It is pretty remarkable. And it all boils down to the perceptron's knack for picking out patterns. It's not just memorizing, it's learning those deeper relationships, the underlying ideas that let it make sense of new stuff.
It's like learning the grammar of a language, not just memorizing a bunch of words.
Exactly.
Now, Rosenblatt also talks about different types of environments for the perceptron. He starts with this ideal environment, which sounds a bit odd. What is that, and why is it important?
So the ideal environment is basically a world of pure randomness, no structure, no organization. The perceptron's just bombarded with random input. It's like a baseline. Rosenblatt uses it to see what the perceptron can do in the most chaotic situation.
Throw it in the deep end, see if it sinks or swims.
Exactly. And even in this random mess, Rosenblatt shows that the perceptron can still learn to make some connections, to link certain responses with certain stimuli, but there's a twist.
There's always a twist. What is it?
Well, as the perceptron learns more and more in this random environment, its performance actually starts to drop. The probability of making the right choice goes down, almost back to random chance. It's like it's getting overloaded.
Makes sense. Like trying to memorize a million random phone numbers. Your brain would just fry.
Exactly. So what's the solution? Well, this is where Rosenblatt brings in the differentiated environment. Instead of all that randomness, now the perceptron encounters patterns, shapes. Things like squares, circles, triangles, a world that's more organized, more meaningful, closer to what we actually experience.
So it's like the perceptron graduates from sensory kindergarten, enters the real world where things start to make sense.
Right. And this shift, it makes a huge difference. The perceptron's ability to learn and generalize, it just takes off. Now, it's not just making simple connections, it's starting to grasp concepts, categories, the whole game changes.
It goes from a noise learner to a pattern machine. That's wild. So how does Rosenblatt explain this leap forward?
He goes back to the math, specifically that PC variable we talked about. Remember, that's the probability of an A unit firing for two different stimuli. But this time, he looks at PC within a category. Like, how likely is an A unit to fire for two different squares, two different circles?
So measuring how well it sees the similarities within a group, right? Like how much does this square resemble that other square?
Exactly. And what he finds is, for good generalization, that within category, PC needs to be higher than the PC between categories. Basically, the perceptron needs to be better at spotting similarities within a group than similarities across different groups.
It's like saying these two squares are more alike than a square and a circle. Makes sense, right? But how does it actually DU that? How does it learn to make those distinctions?
Well, remember those different value dynamics models? Alpha, beta, gamma, those come into play big time. They shape how the perceptron learns, how it forms those sophisticated categories.
So it's not just about turning the volume up or down. It's about fine-tuning the balance of influence within the whole network.
Exactly. And Rosenblatt, he pushes things even further. He introduces this idea of a bivalent system. Up till now, A units could only gain value. Their influence could only increase. But a bivalent system throws in negative reinforcement. Now an A unit can actually lose value.
It's like getting feedback, right?
Yeah.
Not just good job, but also, whoops, try again.
Yep. Adds a whole new layer of complexity, makes it more realistic. Now the perceptron can learn from its mistakes. It can fine-tune its responses, become more discerning.
Like it's developing a more critical eye, learning to see subtle differences, refining its understanding of the world. Man, it's really starting to look like the foundation for modern AI, even with something as seemingly simple as the perceptron.
Right. It's remarkable how much insight he packed into this paper. He explores all sorts of variations, extensions of this basic model, showing how you can adapt it to handle more and more complex tasks.
This is fascinating. What other cool stuff did Rosenblatt uncover?
Well, he delves into some pretty mind-blowing areas, things like selective recall and how the perceptron can handle patterns that unfold over time. It's pretty wild.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked. Tell us more about that. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've seen how the perceptron can learn, generalize, even categorize. But what about memory? Being able to remember specific things. And what about dealing with sequences, like understanding a sentence or a melody? Those seem like such essential parts of intelligence.
Yeah, totally. And this is where Rosenblatt's work gets even more mind-blowing. He goes into this whole thing about selective recall, the ability to pull up specific memories, specific associations based on cues. It's not just about storing information, it's about accessing the right information at the right time.
So it's not just a big data dump. It's more like an organized library. You can actually find what you need.
Exactly. And it all comes down to how those responses are interconnected. Rosenblatt shows how these overlapping groups of A units, he calls them source sets, they allow the perceptron to pick out and recall specific associations, even if they share some common elements.
Like a mental filing system with keywords and cross-references.
That's a great way to put it. The perceptron isn't just a random mess of connections. It's starting to look like a real memory system with structure and organization.
This is so cool. And this structured organization, it leads to another amazing ability, right? Selective attention.
Right. Rosenblatt shows how you can design the perceptron to focus on specific parts of a stimulus while ignoring irrelevant stuff.
Tuning out the noise, zeroing in on what matters. That seems super important for navigating a world that's constantly throwing information at you.
Absolutely. Think about a perceptron that has both visual and auditory inputs. Rosenblatt suggests that with the right training, it could learn to connect sounds, like names, with visual objects. And then it could selectively respond to commands like, name the object on the left, or what color is this?
Wow, that's starting to sound a lot like a system that can understand language.
It is a glimpse into how this model could handle really complex cognitive tasks. But Rosenblatt doesn't stop there. He also explores how the perceptron can deal with time, like recognizing patterns that unfold over a series of events.
Temporal pattern recognition. That's crucial for so much, right? Understanding language, music, even just the flow of actions in everyday life.
Absolutely. He starts with this momentary stimulus perceptron, which can only handle information at a single point in time. But then he explains how to extend this model to deal with those all-important temporal sequences.
So how does he make it time aware? How does he bridge that gap?
By introducing memory, persistence. He proposes that the A units could hold on to a trace of their previous activation, like a lingering echo. So the perceptron's response at any given moment would be shaped not just by what it's seeing now, but also by what it just experienced a moment ago.
It's like it's developing a sense of history.
Yeah.
The past is shaping how it sees the present.
Precisely. And this temporal memory, it allows the perceptron to recognize those sequences, those patterns over time, like a series of flashing lights or a melody played on a piano. It unlocks a whole new level of learning and understanding.
This is incredible. Rosenblatt's taken this network of interconnected units with all its randomness, its simplicity, and shown that it has the potential for such complex cognitive abilities.
It really highlights the power of simple ideas, cleverly combined. But even Rosenblatt, he knew the perceptron wasn't perfect. He pointed out some things it struggled with, especially tasks involving relative judgments and abstract relationships.
Ah, so even the perceptron has its limits. What kind of tasks are we talking about?
Think about asking it to name the object to the left of the square or tell me which pattern came before the circle. Those require understanding relationships between objects, not just recognizing the objects themselves.
Like it can learn the words, but it struggles with the grammar,
Yeah.
the rules that connect those words together.
Perfect analogy. And these limitations, they remind us that the perceptron, as powerful as it is still just a simplified model of the brain. The real thing is vastly more complex.
It makes you realize how much we still don't understand about how our own minds work. But that's what's so exciting about this field, right? This constant exploration, pushing the boundaries of what we know about intelligence.
Couldn't agree more. The perceptron, it's a true landmark. And its impact is still felt today. It paved the way for so much research in neural networks, in AI as a whole. A reminder that even seemingly simple ideas can revolutionize how we think about the world.
This deep dive into the perceptron has been a wild ride. I'm walking away with a whole new appreciation for Rosenblatt's genius, his vision. And I'm sure our listeners are too.
It's amazing how exploring those fundamental ideas with rigor and creativity can open up entirely new ways of seeing things.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We encourage you to check out the Perceptron for yourselves. Dig into its intricacies. Really think about what it means for the future of AI. Until next time, keep those minds curious. Keep exploring.